Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Same thing.
Yeah.
Same project.
Same project, yeah, that's right. Not a lot of variety in the, talent here.
There are capitalized project. There we go. The proper title. So where are we today? As has been the case, as we kind of made the point last week, which is kind of the point of the podcast last week, a lot going on. Want to dig in a little bit more on something that we flagged last time and not a new topic for this podcast. And that is the way in which the attention to immigration and border security in national politics, seems to present a kind of moment of convergence of national and Texas politics. The Texas politics that we've talked about a lot and we talk about all the time. And that's not to say that immigration and border security have not been a simmering, occasionally coming to a boil national issue, in the same window. Right. But we talk about this a lot from the perspective of Texas, and all of a sudden, I guess just the experiential trigger. There's a lot of them there was, sort of reading lots of press accounts in the national political press about how, voters are telling pollsters now that immigration and the border are the most important topics. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are at the top of the MIP, in which we say, well, that's not news from our perspective, but but the movement nationally, is fair enough. And I haven't dug super far into it. I'm sure it's bubbled below the economy and inflation and COVID.
Well, and just to make a point, I think part of what's happened in recent weeks, if not months, but especially if you're looking at the last few weeks here, is that economic indicators have been trending in a better direction. Unemployment has remained low, and so some of the issues. COVID is certainly in the rearview mirror for most people, right? And so to the extent that the COVID is in the rearview mirror, inflation appears to be, there's a lot of talk about a soft landing on the economy now, and that's looking more and more likely. And so it's not surprising that a different issue has sort of supplanted its, taken the top spot.
Immigration's turning the barrel.
Yeah, exactly. I guess.
So and look, there is a lot going on this front right now. As we're recording this, the House Homeland Security Committee is marking up the, long advertised impeachment bill targeting Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. In last week's podcast, on another front, we touched on the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in favor of the federal government and their ability to cut concertina wire fences erected by Texas along the Rio Grande section of the U.S.-Mexico border, on a relatively narrow basis, as you were pointing out, and we were discussing in this ruling. And this was not a fully articulated decision. It was a ruling on a motion.
No, and importantly, just here, what it's done is it's basically allowed the federal government to cut the concertina wire. We talked about this last week. It allows Texas to say, see, the federal government wants to cut the barbed wire. But the state has also taken the ruling as, at least so far, tacit approval of continuing to roll out the wire because they didn't say they couldn't do it. And so
right,
Texas
said they couldn't cut it. Now, should say that on a narrower basis, they have been asked to remove the buoys from Now, this is where I think some of the stuff that we got into the weeds on the buoy case, over the summer kind of matters here, and that, the federal government kind of sidestepped the bigger issue of constitutional authority in that by arguing a fairly narrow statutory issue having to do with the
navigable waterways.
Waters and jurisdiction over them, et cetera. also out there and clearly, and I think, this is important. I think it's lost a little bit. I mean, it either gets overplayed or underplayed, I think. But, you do have to note that, the situation on the ground has not improved. If anything, we are in an uptick.
Yep.
I mean, over time, we've seen the flow of migrants fluctuating. So, it's also fair to point out, and I think this gets played to comparative advantage depending on who's pointing this out, that, the situation on the ground at the border has not improved recently, is and continues to be, a problem. And, seems maybe likely even to get worse in a couple of ways, but, it's hard to predict. But the flow, and we know that the flow of migrants fluctuates from week to week and fluctuates seasonally. But when you look at the data coming out of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the numbers are higher right now.
Yeah.
And certainly among, the migrants seeking asylum, but the overall numbers of encounters, most of those measures are up.
Yeah, and I think if we're just looking within the Biden administration, even right now, December, there were 302,000 encounters, on the southern border. And I mean, that's it's a remarkable amount, even when you look at the data over the entirety of Biden's presidency, whereas in, 2021, you were looking at somewhere between 71,000 and about a little over 200,000 encounters. In 2022, you're looking at somewhere between 150 or so and about 240,000 encounters. 2023, you're looking at 200,000 and up to almost 270,000 encounters. So I mean, anyone who wants to sort of ignore, I think this is something that the Democrats do at their peril a lot, is like there is something going on here. I mean, this is an issue that like is an actual policy problem. To the extent that you can take, let's say the governor's approach to it in terms of like busing migrants to other cities as more or less theater. But the point that I think he's trying to make, and again, setting aside whether you agree with it or the motives or the intentions, he's making the point here, like, this is a big problem. You guys should see this. And I think, to some extent, I don't want to give Abbott all the credit here, and we'll kind of come back to this, but like, it's kind of worked. It's expanded the scope of the conflict. It's expanded the scope of the conversation. It's put a lot of Democrats in a lot of, uncomfortable positions in some cases, if you're the Democratic mayor of some of these cities, if you're a congressional candidate in some cases. And so, but to say this is not something that's being, let's just say, generated out of whole cloth. Like, this is because the encounters have gone up so much.
Right. And so, you kind of, raised the Abbott point, and, that obviously the governor has been central to this issue as a, not accidentally and not simply responsively. I mean,
right.
I think it's fair to say. And, and again, the politics of this have very much kind of worked out, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling, Republican governors have almost uniformly expressed support for Abbott's tactics as challenge to the federal authority, or both.
Yeah. And I should say that move on their part is it's a little bit cheap, just in the sense that you had Trump basically saying that, these Republican governors should be mobilizing their National Guards and sending them to the border to help Abbott out. And so It's a lot easier to say, no, we support what Abbott's doing. And
it's also, it's played and created this other kind of sideshow, right?
Yes.
Or, we were talking about this on the way in. I mean, this morning as we were driving in, I mean, this whole kind of side piece of, is there, a civil war brewing on the border? And we talked about this a little bit last year because of the, the conflict being between enforcement arms of both governments.
Right.
Right. And so, and that has played, relatively well for the governor. So, we'll come back to this piece about where Abbott is, that's kind of where we're headed a little bit. But that also then is just brewing out there as part of the context here. I think one of the key bits going on that has really fueled a lot of the national coverage, aside from, the policy problem, right, and the day-to-day, is the speculation about the content of a bipartisan deal that's been, Under negotiation in the Senate, I mean, the key figures have been, this has been ongoing for several months. I mean, it is the Senate, after all, U.S. Senate. This is a deal that includes, is interesting for what it includes, but also for what it doesn't include, I think, right? So, and again, a lot of this is speculative. I'm going to give some general ideas because if you go back and you look at what's been leaked out of these negotiations, we still, as of this recording, we haven't seen a bill.
Right.
But you get a sense. So there's new emergency powers granted to DHS under the executive branch to quote unquote shut down the border at certain migrant encounter thresholds. And the numbers that have come out of that have varied a lot. So I'm not even going to delve into that. But we should say, particularly given a point that will come up shortly, if not immediately, the idea that seems to be floating in this bill that, is being taken as the power to shut down the border really means suspending asylum at official points of entry.
Right.
At least in most of the things that I've read. Right.
Really and really, I mean, what we mean is just suspending the processing of asylum claims when, encounters have reached some threshold. Right. So it's a small point, but it's a big part of it's really the flashpoint in a lot of ways about right now in terms of when people are talking about immigration.
Well, and of course, as we were talking about, just to put it on the table, the president really leaned into this when, in encouraging the negotiations, he said in a speech a couple days ago that, he encouraged the bill and, if they gave him the power to shut down the border, he would shut down the border. That drove Democrats on the left, bananas. It set the stage for, the emerging pushback from Republicans that don't want to make this deal, including, Ted Cruz prominently, since we're a Texas podcast, saying, look, you don't need a legislation to do this. You could do this right now. Now, there's a lot of inconsistencies to that.
Yes, Cruz is very clear on the record that Congress needs to fix the immigration system until right now.
Right, and even Trump had said he wanted Congress to act when he was president. The politics of that, of course, have changed. And then there's, a big bucket of money that the administration has asked for, and we don't know how much of this is in the bill. They've asked, some reports are they've asked for $14 billion for additional enforcement, additional asylum officers, additional border agents, and critically, more immigration judges. And this has been, an ongoing problem going back at least to the Obama presidency that, there were just not enough judges to hear all these cases, that when you get these surges to follow the law, they get a hearing, they have to have a hearing, and the hearing can, people are scheduled for a hearing and then released, and the hearing is years in the future.
Yeah, and this is a problem that predates any surge you can think of.
Yeah, right. So this is, and I think it's worth noting that this is an effort to recognize and address that problem. Whether it works, whether it's not, the sense of it. We were talking before we came on, it's a lot of, you need to find a lot of judges because what they want to do is, sort of say that, you have to get a thumbs up or a thumbs down within 6 months.
Right.
Is one of the details.
We'll come back to this, but is that really the problem that people perceive?
Right.
Also a big part of this.
And so, and then the other thing that's been one of the sticking points, or one of the other things, is changes to the president's so-called immigration parole authority, which gives the president, the ability to grant limited parole to migrants of certain classes. It's been used mostly, most recently by Biden on, to expedite the hearings and allow the migration of migrants from Ukraine, some Latin American countries, Venezuela, kind of a special cases exception that, by all reports, Republicans really want to ratchet down and limit. For this president and future presidents. So,
and it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And we'd have to get someone who's more of an expert in this, but you can imagine, absent any sort of big comprehensive reform, it's not surprising that administrations, both Democrats and Republicans, have leaned more on these kind of special exceptions because there's almost, there has been and continues to be zero chance that Congress is going to address any of these things in any sort of particular or even broader way.
And it gives presidents powers to respond to, short-term or, politics that are right in front of them. The Ukrainian thing is a good example. I said what's interesting about this in part is what's not in here. we have a battery in the poll, and we put it in the December poll that was kind of aimed at, what is essentially, last decade's comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, what's missing from here? There's no treatment of DACA. Right? There's no discussion of what to do with long-term residents. There's no what we used to call the path to citizenship.
Right.
Even that was a little bit, really was a better path to legal residency in most cases.
No discussion of priorities for legal immigration, what that looks
right.
like.
Yeah. Nothing about workforce issues, H-1B, this is, what are the, are we going to, move people with desired skills ahead of the line.
Right. And and to the extent that, this bill is controversial on both, the right and the left. On the left, there's a lot of concern because there's no discussion of what to do about DACA and those programs and these exceptions. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then also the thing we're missing is checking the legality of workers.
E-Verify.
E-Verify. No, so I think if you step back, no E-Verify, no DACA, none of these things that for a long time were, there was kind of all those things and then some enforcement stuff. This is all pretty much enforcement.
Yeah, and it's all really, really it's all really, really focused on the southern border. And it's all really, heavily focused on this issue of asylum seekers, right? I mean, which is again one of the many paths we could talk about here, in terms of the overarching immigration system. So
I think you have to kind of keep that in mind. And then, another thing going on here, you've got the context of the bill as part of this grand. I mean, this is really how it emerged.
Yeah.
As part of a grand foreign aid bill. I mean, the initial idea was this was a way to balance out and engage Republican opposition to another big aid package for Ukraine.
Right.
The October 7th attacks in Israel happened. Then Israel got dropped into this, as did Taiwan. As the bill was being discussed in the last quarter or so of 2023, the story was kind of, the split between the Senate, where there were GOP skeptics on this, but more interest, particularly Mitch McConnell. And I think the Ukraine piece was a huge part of this, right? Yeah. And that McConnell is, among Republicans, one of the bigger supporters of the U.S. going all in behind Ukraine, or reasonably all in, and continuing to support Ukraine against in their resistance to the Russian invasion. But all along, and this, and that deal actually didn't help.
Right.
This is that, it was a non-starter among a majority of the GOP House.
Right.
Right. They have their own bill, H.R. 2, which is much more enforcement, weaken the executive branch oriented. So look, there's been a lot of skepticism about this all along. I mean, I've always been torn by, we've talked about it a few times, been talking about it too much or not enough, given what the ultimate prospects were.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing too is, this is one of those moments where it's like sort of the politics of it don't obviously line up very easily in terms of just, I think, people's ability to understand what's going on. I think the way you laid it out there is really kind of perfect in some ways, which is you have a Senate that is, generally more interested in some of these foreign policy issues than the House, and is more willing to devote, financial resources to the foreign policy concerns of the U.S. and the administration, right? And again, that's not uniform, but I mean, I'm just saying they have more.
Yeah, right.
And then that creates, the space to negotiate over an immigration bill that is really focused on GOP priorities, because ultimately you're trying to bring over the GOP holdsouts. At the same time, if you're looking at the House and thinking about House-Senate negotiations, the House is kind of sitting there saying, well, our majority party in the House has no interest in Ukraine funding, basically, for the most part. And we've talked about the public opinion of this. And we've already passed, an immigration bill that's far, far stricter than anything you're talking about. So, you can negotiate with us, but the room for negotiation there is really pretty narrow, right?
Yeah.
And it's basically make your immigration bill stricter and strip out all the other stuff. It's like, well, that's what actually got this across the finish line in the Senate.
Right. I mean, the smart money on this has always been, this is just not going to go anywhere in the House. There's nothing they can really do. That still seems to be the smartest bet.
It seems to be the smartest bet because the only reason you could see that changing would be, if the politics of this changed such that, the exposure. I mean, this is really what and we're moving this direction, but the exposure of not passing an immigration deal that's put in front of you becomes too big. But it doesn't look like the current politics are actually creating that kind of exposure, at least in the current moment, right?
And I mean, there's been there's been the perpetual immigration problem lurking below this, and that it's hard to find something that both the right wing of the Republican Party and the left wing of the Democratic Party will settle on.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's just that's kind of perpetual. But, however one handicapped it at that point or, handicaps it on, the merits, the confirmation of Donald Trump's, inevitability in, by the results, in the results in Iowa and New Hampshire, triggered a shift in the public positions of many GOP members of Congress. I mean, even, I think it might have been misreported or it was a little bit of a problem of when you report something from inside a closed meeting with an anonymous source. Yeah. I mean, there was a moment last week when it seemed like it was just dead because McConnell in an in-house meeting in the Senate had said, look, the reality here is, not to put words in his mouth, but this was the implication, if Donald Trump doesn't want this, then the politics of this have changed. That was taken as McConnell abandoning ship, and the early waves of reporting seemed like it's gotten a little bit more complicated, at least in terms of McConnell's view. But the underlying reality is that the political math now has changed in obvious ways. If Donald Trump is, as part of becoming the presumptive candidate, is now telling people, sending very clear messages that, this bill should not be passed.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I think, you're sitting here just sort of as an observer of politics and kind of thinking about, you're not sitting here saying, oh, this is shocking.
Right.
The major party presidential nominee is basically saying, hey, don't do anything that's going to, that I perceive is going to hurt, my general election campaign. At the same time, you're sort of sitting here, and in that part of that kind of behind closed doors McConnell piece of this, McConnell was, apparently said, look, this is a better deal than we're going to get under Trump. Now, I think part of that is that Democrats have a desire to negotiate here. They've made a clear willingness to negotiate on this. If Trump is president, there's no reason for Democrats to negotiate on any of this.
I think McConnell and defenders of the plan are making, from a Republican point of view, and the pitch to Republicans, is the point we were making a couple minutes ago. It's like, look, this has none of the quote unquote. There's no Democratic stuff in here.
Yeah, and you're going to get Democratic votes on this. You're going to move this thing forward. You're going to get more money than you would get, or you can have 100% opposition the next round. And also, the other piece that I think, for McConnell, it's sort of the quiet part that, probably not even saying out loud is, and honestly, Trump is a much less reliable bargaining partner. Yeah. The thing about Biden is I think, you can say what you want about Biden. People can have all kinds of attitudes about Biden. But I think when McConnell deals with Biden from the perspective of a senator trying to move a bill through, he knows what he's dealing with and he knows what's going on. Whereas I think, the Trump presidency shows you is that in Trump, you don't have a consistent ally or leader when it comes to these kind of negotiations, which makes it really easy for this stuff to fall apart. And so I think both strangely enough, it's a heavier lift under Trump in some ways, at least just in terms of the relationship with the executive branch, but also you're not going to get as good of a deal. And yet.
Yeah. And what Trump is willing to.
And what he even wants. So that brings us, the politics of this are really what become kind of the central driver now. Right.
And I think, this is where we, kind of talk about, look, there's an interest, the interesting thing here. I think whatever your perspective, and this has been covered, discussed a lot in the political press, is the kind of, the notion that the pressure that Trump is exerting here now and the general theory of the case that we're seeing people either following Trump's lead or doing the math on themselves is dangerously close in some people's views to, we're now saying the quiet part out loud, which is, yes, this is a very good deal for Republicans. No, we're not going to take it because it hurts our presidential candidate.
You're not going to say, why? Are you holding out for a better deal? It's like,
there's really, that's not, look, the Speaker Johnson is saying that, but nobody
Yeah, but nobody could believe that.
Well, nobody thinks the flips. People know it's not gonna get through the Senate, even if it gets through the House, which it probably which it has. And this is House Resolution 2. But it, I think in all fairness, there's a little bit of this on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, to be utterly fair, Joe Biden saying, I'll just give me the power and I'll shut down the border.
I'll say on a Friday night.
Right, which is it's kind of, it's another variation of that theme, which is, we all see the politics of this. Mm-hmm. We all know, me saying that is a provocation, but we also know that it's a function of the politics of the moment. And, I don't think anybody ought to just have their hair on fire about, in some ways, either one of these is a development. There's nothing very surprising about this other than, we don't all that often see all these conditions we spent the last, 15 minutes talking about. It's a lot of interesting alignment at once.
Yeah.
Right. To create this moment where both parties are somewhat exposed. And I don't mean that in the sense of a false equivalence. I mean,
no, but it's important to say this.
But
because I think there's a focus here to say, look, whether it's the press, whether it's whoever, I don't really care. But there's a point here where, I think for a lot of people on the left, a lot of press are saying, oh, caught you.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, look, you're being offered this amazing deal and, faced with this great deal, that's everything you've said you've wanted, like at least in this moment, to respond to this moment. When Trump says, well, that might not be good for my reelection campaign. He's like, oh, this isn't for us. We're going to pull back. Now, to some extent, we've been making this argument all along, which is say, look, the border is a mobilizing issue for Republicans is incredibly valuable. You really have to kind of come around to this. Ask yourself whether it's, better for Republicans as a party that wants to win elections to just solve the border problem today,
right,
or whether they can hold on to it. At the same time, as much as there's this kind of almost gleeful, caught you being hypocrites. The reality is when Biden comes out and says, on a Friday night, like, I'll shut down the border. One, he's playing into this politics just as much as they are because it's kind of, ridiculous. But the other piece of it, too, is it's an acknowledgement by Biden that, like, what Democrats are doing on this is not working.
Right.
And it really does also expose the problems that Democrats have within their coalition. The fact is, are Democrats going to have problems? Even if the Senate bill were to move forward, the fact that there's no DACA component to it, the fact that there's really none of the things that Democrats have said that they care about on the border, is pretty notable. But it also is the case. And I think, something I think Biden is actually doing a pretty good job of in the moment is acknowledging the fact that, like, there is no consensus position among Democrats on the border.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of important to acknowledge. And that's kind of what's created the problem. That's what's created a vacuum. It's part of why it's such a powerful issue for Republicans, because the Democratic response isn't, it isn't a known thing because really, it's like, well, we don't want to say we're going to immediately deport everybody and like we take asylum seekers seriously, but what if there's 300,000 of them a month?
Right.
And Democrats are hemming and hawing about, well, what's going on in the country, where these people are coming from. And for, I think, Republicans and for most voters, that's complicated. Not just Republicans, but for most voters, that's a complicated construction of this, right?
Yeah, and when we get to the end, I want to come back to it because I looked up some of this stuff.
It's a lot easier just to say what's going on at the border.
Right. And so, what to me, we're already sort of edging in. What do we make of the implications of this?
Right.
And what do we think about this in terms of the convergence of, what has been, a mainstay of Texas politics now for more than a decade, and now that having another moment in the sun, if you will, in national politics. Trump's hold on the nomination, which is, again, reflective of his hold on the party, has dovetailed with an interesting surge in national attention to Greg Abbott's combative policies on the border. Mm-hmm. And, yet again raises, the question, as you were saying earlier, of like, what is Abbott doing here, right? And I think, look, on one hand, it's pretty obvious what he's doing. On the other hand, it has, Abbott's sustained provocation, on this, on this one. I think we said in the podcast, you sometimes imagine the Abbott folks kind of sitting around, in a conference room going, well, so what are we going to do next?
Yeah.
To like stir the pot on this. What could be most, we've bust, we've done buoys,
Yeah, and I want to say, what they've done that's been so, I want to say, from someone who watches politics for entertainment as well as edification, one of the things that I think, when you say that, like they're sitting around this table thinking, what are we going to do? And I know you're joking and you're fake, but I think the thing that's been so, brilliant, and I'm going to use that word, I'm going to use the word brilliant about the way that they've done it, is it's not so much about what they do, it's about what the response is going to be from the people that they do it to. And they've been spot on every time on that. The idea is like, we're busing, basically migrants to Democratic-run cities that say they're open to migration. And you say, well, that's a human rights abuse, and it's like, well, they signed waivers. They said they wanted to go. And then you've got these, mayors in New York and Chicago and the other places basically, hey, can you stop doing that?
Yeah, all of that is played out.
We don't want them. We don't know what to do with these people.
And what they complained to Abbott, but they also complained to the White House,
right?
And so that
and same thing. We talked about this with the concertina. Where it's like, okay, so Texas, whatever case the federal government wins, even if the Supreme Court drags us out for a while, ultimately it allows the state to say, see, they're trying to stop us from securing the border.
Right. And so, so what we're seeing politically then is, everybody, Republicans by and large doubling down on, the ever expanding Operation Lone Star. Again, we beat a dead horse in here. Public opinion among the Republican base gives an enormous amount of space here and has empowered this. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting, again, for how many years have we talked about, the underlying question about Greg Abbott's seeming efforts to build his brand nationally, and things that, have quietly gone away because, they keep being proven wrong. And is Greg Abbott going to run for president? Does he want to be vice president? Does he want to be in the cabinet? This whole thing, when, it may very well be enough that this is very good politics for Greg Abbott, if he wants to stay where he is, and particularly amongst not a lot of evidence other than this profile that he wants to do something else.
Yeah, I'll be honest, though. Up until this moment, I don't think his profile ever really justified all of the speculation, right? I think now he's...
Yeah, that's what we kept saying, and,
let alone the fact that there's been just repeated statements of a lack of interest by anyone close to him. But the thing is that to the extent that, right now, I was saying during the, kind of leading into this year's primary election for president, one of the things that, Greg Abbott has that DeSantis doesn't is a 1,200-mile border with Mexico. Yeah. And Abbott has really wrung every political dollar out of that conflict and that, that asset. And it's taken him a little while. Yeah. But, I think he's really hit his stride with it now, obviously.
And if you think about, the long term, it's funny you raised DeSantis. What was it, a year and a half ago, there was all this, there's this competition between Abbott and DeSantis and, who is busing migrants first and who's busing the most and who's going to come up with the most creative place to ship them. It's probably been a pretty good week in the governor's mansion, after the DeSantis, the culmination of the slow DeSantis flame out, I guess we should say. And, look, we were, small behind the scenes anecdote. As we were looking at, thinking about some stuff about Texas Politics Project Business and the website, and, we saw this little interesting spike in web traffic for, people downloading the graphic of trends in Greg Abbott's job approval over time in our poll. And it was an unmistakable spike. Now, relative to our traffic, we're not talking, like millions of hits, but, it clearly became like the number one page for a few days last week, and it's still kind of hanging in there. I was checking last night. It's declining back to normal, but something happened, and we saw that, dug into it, saw a similar pattern nationally in Google Trends search data for Abbott. So some of this you can kind of locate. So last week, Trump applauded Abbott on social media and I think in a speech, and some people kind of geared up. Who knows what happened? There was there's a hashtag that shortly trended for a little bit within this universe about supporting Abbott or something like this.
I mean, we talk about this in other contexts, but it's pretty unusual for an out-of-state politician to have have high or even approaching high name ID in a state that they're not in or near or adjacent to. And so I think it would be easy, again, especially for people who listen to this podcast, to sort of assume Abbott has a larger national profile, than he might, right? But I think this is the sort of thing that's interesting here is, despite sort of various efforts to kind of put himself out front on different issues, the constellation of, again, the national, this national discussion over immigration, the GOP nominating contest, his continued escalation on the border has probably pushed him into a different stratosphere in terms of basically just his overall awareness.
A different level. I'm not sure.
Well, the stratosphere
not sure he's in the stratosphere, but
but I mean, I don't know. But I mean, it would be interesting to look at, again, it's not often that out-of-state entities are doing, in-state polling on out-of-state politicians. So it's now we're going to see where Abbott's sitting in Missouri right now, or New Hampshire, or New York. But if we did, and if they had done it before, I would be shocked if his name ID hadn't gone up dramatically in that. I'd say dramatically, probably. I mean, he's been pretty active.
Yeah, I mean, he was, in a much narrower sense, they were, some of the polling entities, including Fox, were putting him in the early presidential heats, and he was not moving the needle at all.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, that's
a different context.
Yeah, and that is a question where you're allowed one choice.
Right.
And that's the thing. It's kind of like the MIP thing. We said, you tell us what's your most important. It doesn't mean there aren't other problems out there. It doesn't mean there are other politicians that you're interested in. But when we say what's the one, he was going to fall pretty far behind, the people who are actually running, first of all, and Trump. So
I guess, to begin to wind down and speak to the what's right in front of most people in Texas right now, or people likely to be listening to this, is so if Abbott is getting this boost one way or the other, and we have, I think confirmed this general point that, his track record and our polling suggests that there's just not much that Abbott can do in terms of enforcement and punitive measures that isn't helpful to him with the Republican base, certainly in Texas. And you're kind of implying, it's getting him some national play. But, how does this play into what people are really, focusing on right now, which is, the legislative primaries underway, particularly on the Republican side, where Abbott has been, very active.
Yeah, I mean, there was something in Quorum report this week about, Abbott basically Abbott's campaign entities, I want to say Abbott in particular, I have to go and look at the ads, but basically Abbott-aligned forces or money is basically trying to paint voucher opponents in Republican primaries as essentially anti-public education because they didn't support the voucher bill, which also included a bunch of other stuff that ultimately was not going anywhere anyway. And so there's sort of, some sour grapes about that. Now, I think going into this, we've sort of been asking this question. I think it still is an open question: is how much push does Abbott have, in these primaries? Now, he obviously has the ability financially to do kind of what he wants, but ultimately that's different than saying, doesn't matter if I'm a voter. And I would say in this moment, I mean, this probably breaks really well for him because right now he's sitting here kind of at the center of, maybe not the center, but pretty close to the center of this national discussion over immigration policy. He's got, a signed letter from, basically all the other Republican, governors essentially supporting his efforts at the border. He's raised the issue's profile. He's raised his own profile. And that's the context now in which he's going to these, primary elections and saying, hey, you should support X over Y, or this is, I'm supporting this challenger. That really, I would say, I was skeptical about, the likelihood of Abbott really having that much impact. But in the moment, as a shorthand, I mean, he is, in a prime position on the number one issue for most Republican primary voters and most Republican voters.
Right.
So, I mean, you'd think that this is a pretty good spot for him to be in if this is what he wants.
Right. I mean, and as I think it through, it's, it enhances his political heft and his political capital when he appears for some of these folks. Mm-hmm. He's going to spend the money he's going to spend. That was not going to hurt.
Right.
So there's there's a certain indirectness to this that's very interesting, in that, his political capital comes not from, the issue that he's really seems to be motivating him, but, it doesn't really matter.
Well, no, that's right.
I guess at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, but that's a good.
Or matters, not so much.
But it's going to be. I mean, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see. Let's say Abbott's really successful in clearing out, voucher opponents in the Republican primaries. It's going to be interesting to come back around again, in 2025, and assume vouchers is on the is on the emergency items, right? So they can get going right away. And he's going to say, look, Republican voters were clear.
Right.
They wanted vouchers, and it's like. And we're going to be sitting here on the podcast kind of sheepishly raising our hands going, well.
Only sort of. They definitely liked, busing migrants to New York.
Definitely liked all the concertina wire,
yeah. And I guess if we're going to drill down, there's also I think that it, the visibility of this fight and the skirmishes between Texas and the national government has also allowed the other kind of external force in these primaries, Ken Paxton, to get his name in the news on subjects that, don't include the terms indictment or whistleblower.
Right.
In other words, he's, the face of the state's legal resistance to the federal government. And, that gives him plenty of opportunities to associate his name with something else that is, much more positive or at least less ambiguous. He doesn't have to, he kind of has had to make the case that the impeachment made you not a conservative if you supported his impeachment. He doesn't have to make the case that taking the fight to Washington, D.C. on border security and immigration is the conservative Republican thing to do.
Well, the thing is,
and in that sense, it's helpful to him. I don't know in some definitive sense, but as he's traveling around the state looking for talking points and looking to not talk about and sort of put some distance between him and the legal difficulties, particularly given his about face that we talked about last week on the whistleblower case, pretty good break for him too. Again, I don't want to say it's, solves his problems, but in the short term, pretty helpful.
Well, I mean, it's like, the about face, the context of the about face as he tried to claim it was essentially, hey, look, I've got more important stuff to do. And I mean, the number one thing on that list is going to be challenging the Biden administration on border issues.
Right.
Right. And so that's the thing, to the extent that anyone is going to ask, Ken Paxton about the whistleblowers or about, that ongoing case or other issues, proper undisclosed properties, such as say, look, I'm focused on the border. And honestly, that answer is pretty much good enough.
Yeah. Pretty good for Republican primary voters, that's for sure.
But it is funny, though, just to say, just because you made this point, and I would just want to sit on it for 1 second, it is funny to think that, leading into these primaries, where it's like, okay, is Abbott going to be able to mobilize on the voucher issue? Is Paxton going to be able to mobilize on the impeachment as a measure of conservatism? And we've been saying all along, kind of leading through the trials, like, yeah, but that's why the border's on the call. That's why they're the things that are going to pass are going to be these things that they can lean back on. And it's amazing that even before we're really getting into the final heat of the primary, it's already kind of shifted back to immigration.
Right.
I mean, both of those guys are almost already just going to lean on immigration, really as the issue that sort of is their power base.
You've talked about this a bit. I want to raise this, it kind of re-raises the question that, has come up with this, particularly with Republicans all along, and that is, people want to address the border problem. Do they really want to solve it?
Yeah, it's tough. I go back and forth between, being totally, maybe cynical, on one hand and saying no. The politics of the issue are too good for Republicans, and they're
the dynamic we were talking about,
and they're
before,
too difficult for Democrats.
Yeah, the dynamic we were talking about before, where Republicans are standing up saying, "Yeah, we can't solve this problem right now."
Yeah, right.
Sort of, does lean and push one in that direction.
But I do want to be fair, because I have that sort of cynical response. The other piece of it is that, the politics of it also, makes solving it more difficult. And not just because of it's like, if we come to something, do you gain and do I lose because of that? But it's also about, the conceptualization of the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And we've talked about this before, but, Republicans really focus on immigration and the border and border security. But really what they're focused on is the border. We're not really talking about what's going on in Venezuela. We're not talking about what's going on in Honduras. We're not talking about why anybody's leaving any of these places or whether it's a valid reason, what we could do with, international agreements, all kinds of stuff kind of leading up to this point. It's sort of like, what if we build a wall and put, barbed wire and more guns there? And it's like, yeah, I mean, and that's a conceptualization of the issue. I'm not saying, I'm not even saying whether it's wrong or right. I'm just saying, but if your thought is the 1,200-mile border is where the action is, you're going to come to a different set of solutions in terms of solving the problem than if we think about all the stuff you talked about at the beginning. The legal pathways of citizenship, the asylum process, what border security looks like, what deportation looks like, whether there's a pathway to citizenship, who's accepted from these things.
Right.
These are all, there's a lot of negotiations that go into all that. And so, I would say there is that aspect of it, but it does, just in the politics of right now, setting all that aside, it doesn't really seem like anybody really has the will to solve it, right? I mean, I think Biden's willingness to close the border, whether you take it seriously or not, is probably a response to the fact that there's a pretty clear argument that Democrats would be a lot better off if the border were less of an issue, right? It's just not an issue they win on. But the ideological politics within the Democratic Party make this pretty challenging. I mean, you've got, as I said before, what is the central tendency of Democrats on immigration on the border? It's like, I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends on who you're talking about. In Texas, we saw, Colin Allred joining with mostly Republicans and some Democrats from Texas, in a statement basically, I would say criticizing Biden's handling of the border. Allred was quick to caveat that and say, well, whatever.
Which led to, an exchange about, that cuts to the core of how Allred is defining himself versus how, his main opponent, Roland Gutierrez, is defining himself, in this past week. Also in the news, during their appearances in which, Allred's position was, of course, vilified by Roland Gutierrez as the essence of like what's wrong, with Democrats. Right. And brought that fundamental cleavage in the Democratic Party out. Right. And Gutierrez is is in a good shape to engage this conversation, given his background. I mean, he knows the policy. He's from the border area, represents, so. But that doesn't get you any. I mean, not that gets us anywhere. But it does show that those, as you were saying, those politics are bubbling under and problematic when they arise in the Democratic Party as well. And, we're seeing this at the national level. Alex Padilla was quoted in Politico this morning, quote, "I'm absolutely disappointed, and talking about Biden, it's very different than the pledges and the promises he made as a candidate for president in 2020.
So disappointed.
Right. And, again, whatever you make of that, it does underline, that aspect of the issue.
Right. And so, for Democrats, this is kind of just a perpetual loser, and the truth is, I think actually Biden has probably made more progress on Democratic messaging in the last week on the border than I think we've seen in the last few years, honestly. Now, the thing is, so we were already talking about the right a lot, but the situation is completely different on the right, where, when we look at polling, Republican voters are uniformly ready to support almost anything that might improve the situation, I'm saying, as they see it, which is really focused on the border. Yet, Trump has made clear that, basically we're not moving forward, with a Senate bill, And even as, and I think this raises the question, for me that I'm sort of trying to struggle with, but, and I think it actually hits back to something earlier that you said earlier, thinking about, Biden's sort of willingness to close the border and sort of the Republican response to that. But the question that I sort of keep thinking about is, what could Biden offer or say they would do where Texas would stand down and say, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And there's nothing. And it kind of goes back to the whole, sort of like, well, Biden says he's going to shut the border down. And if you think about the response of most, Republican senators, Republican legislators, Republican voters, be like, yeah, right. And there's just like, we don't believe that that's going to happen. But this is the problem, though, right? I mean, ultimately, you do need to have some set of demands or a solution where the federal government, where Biden said, give me your list of demands, Greg Abbott. What do you want to see me do? Which, again, super problematic, whole system, whatever. Let's set that aside. What would that list look like? And let's say, you take the things that are realistically possible on that list, and let's say the Biden administration said, we're going to do all those things tomorrow, right? Let Democratic AGs sue us for it, whatever. Is all of a sudden, is Abbott going to withdraw DPS from the border? I don't think so. Is the state going to all of a sudden say, let's claw back all that money we've, put into Operation Lone Star? I don't think so, but it raises the question, what's the off-ramp here?
I mean, I think, part of the question here is, on one hand, we posted is, does anybody want to solve the border, but solve this issue?
Yeah.
And how, the interesting politics are, the Democrats, Biden anyway, obviously seems more than willing to do something to try to move it off the table, whether it's solving or not. But it's also the question of how solvable is this, right?
Right.
And look, in the short term, I don't, you can make the problem look different, but I don't think you're going to, none of this is going to solve this in the next year.
Yeah, and I think a good example, and this is where,
they could give them the money today.
Well, this is where I think Texas is a great example, right? We've got, in Texas, this has been the perpetual number one issue for the majority party. The state has continuously and session after session devoted more and more resources and significantly more dollars to the border. And when we ask, and are we spending enough on immigration and border security? And overwhelmingly, 2/3 of Republicans continue to say no, despite the increases in spending. Because ultimately, and I say why, and I mean, I think we'd have to speculate on the why of this, but I think the pattern and the attitudes in response to this tells you something, which is that even were they to come along and actually, have some huge bill that puts a bunch more money towards the border, I don't suspect that tomorrow or next week or in a month, Republican voters are going to say, well, glad that's solved. What now?
Well, and there's no, but I think there's two reasons for that. Again, because there would be no evidence before their eyes that it was as well.
Right. There would definitely be no evidence of that.
But also you're right. I mean, the underlying attitudes, before we came down here to record, I was going back and digging out some of the data that we always dig out. But I looked at it, I looked at the most recent results on what we call in our internal lingo, the immediate deportation question,
right,
which is a question that we talked about. It's kind of our you were talking about underlying attitudes. It's one of our underlying attitude heat checks where you just say, you agree or disagree, anybody in the country with any undocumented
person in the country should be
deported immediately. And there's no, and you go back to when I think one of the first times we asked that, which was in mid-2014. Mm-hmm. And then you go back to the last time we asked it in August of 23. And it's hard not to look at the views of the issue and its sort of evergreen quality as embedded in how fixed those numbers are.
Yeah.
I mean, overall, in 2014, it was 54 agree with immediate deportation, 40 disagree. In August of 23, it was 54-38.
Yep.
Republican agreement has increased from about 3/4 to a little more than 4/5. So in 2014, it was 74 agree, 23 disagree. In August of last year, it was 83-15.
Right.
Now, that's moved a little bit, but so is the Democratic number.
Right.
Right. So the Democratic numbers in 2014 were nearly a third agreed, 32%, 60% disagreed. In August, it was 27 agree, 63% disagree. But that agreement number has, if you look across all of those results, and we've asked this question 10 or 12 times now, doesn't get any lower than about a fifth of Democrats, and gets as high, even a little higher than a third.
Right. And I mean, when you
and then true independents have not moved, like 56-37 in 2014, 55-33 in August of 23.
And again, not to be cynical, but you look at those numbers and say, well, doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm in a lead and I'm trying to position myself, I realize this is evergreen. We can keep spending money on this. We can keep politicking on this. On the one hand, we put the other party in a tough position because they're going to have to either take a position that 60% or 30% of their voters are a little bit, either uncomfortable with or disagree with.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I hate to be like, this sort of, cynical or whatever politics guy, but it's like, why would you move this issue off the table? And I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, it's sort of, watching the last week and thinking about, again, sort of the idea of, someone like Mitch McConnell kind of trying to push for this bill because he actually wants to move something because he's probably looking at his own legacy at, at this point.
Well, and, I think, look, Mitch McConnell really wanted that Ukraine bill. And I think he also does look at this and think, I've been here a long time. This is the best immigration deal I've seen for Republicans that has any, that's moving at all.
Right.
That I've seen.
Yeah. But if your consideration is, policy outcomes, great. If your consideration is next election, different calculation.
Right.
Well,
and I think, even, with McConnell, I mean, look, I think if you're a Republican that's not named Trump,
yeah,
you could argue that in strict policy terms, and I think, that's what's sort of exposing a lot of the dynamics we're talking about. Setting aside the reality of its chances of passing, it's a pretty good deal for Republicans.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
in terms of what you could go, even these voters here that we're talking about, they may damn you with faint praise.
Yeah.
But, it's not a bad deal for them in that you can say, look, we made it harder to get in the country. Mm-hmm. We made it easier to throttle the movement of people at the border in legal ways.
We're going to get people through asylum processing faster, much, much faster.
So, so it's hard for me to, to kind of wind up to not see the ultimate constraints here dwelling in kind of two related pieces, right? One, these underlying attitudes that I just sort of summarized that are just remarkably stable across time and point Republicans, as you were, sort of laying out, in an obvious political direction. And then the other piece, the degree to which, Donald Trump's brand in the party, his power in the party, his power with the base is plugged directly into those attitudes. Mm-hmm. And so, it makes even the, the kind of quote unquote, this is a good policy win, as we are suggesting, or you can make the argument, it just doesn't, we're not, all these things we've talked about are are sort of converging in a way that both creates the opportunities for this deal and for this deal to move a little further than we've seen before, but at the same time makes it highly unlikely that it's going to go all the way.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, all I'm thinking is, all it really takes, even if Republicans in the Congress had said, this is a great deal, all it would take is for Trump to say they're caving to Biden.
Right. Well, that's
and that's basically
which is what he said,
and that's all it takes, and that's the end of that, right?
Yeah, and
it doesn't matter what the bill does or how it compares to past
and
negotiations.
and if you imagine another world that it's like a null set, it's not reality, where Trump said, you know what, this is a good start, and when I get elected, we're going to do much more. But for now, as we all know, the border, we're being invaded. Even if this is just sticking a finger in the dike, it's okay.
Yeah.
Now, it would probably hurt my head if Donald Trump actually said that.
Yeah, I was going to say, man.
But, but it's not the convergence of these things I was talking about. It's just unimaginable given Trump's political position. So with that, we'll wind it up there. Thanks to you, Josh, for a good conversation. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. The data we talked about, particularly that deportation data, you'll find at the response to that deportation question. You will find at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.